I wanted to take a moment to make a quick footnote about the video that I made on altruism and selfishness. At the end of that video, I said, very often selfishness at one level proves to be altruism at another, and altruism itself is usually action in the service of a higher self. So that was more than a little bit vague, so I want to try to clear up what I meant. In Inesa's lecture, she talked about the evolution of altruism from what we can call the gene's eye view. When you take the gene's eye view, any story that you tell about the evolution of a trait must eventually become a story about the change in gene frequencies over time. This is a very useful perspective to take. In fact, it's the main perspective that biologists use, because gene theory has proven to be quite powerful. But just because it's a very useful perspective doesn't mean that it's the only valid perspective. There's another story that can be told about the evolution of cooperation called group selection, which keeps track of things slightly differently. Instead of focusing on genes at a level below the organism, group selection focuses on groups at a level above the organism. Let's take a look at honeybees as an example. Honeybees are eusocial insects, meaning most bees give up their ability to reproduce directly and instead spend their lives helping their mother, the queen, to make more sisters. This is a classic example of altruism. From the gene's eye view, eusociality evolved in honeybees because they have this unique haplodiploid sex determination system, which causes sisters to be more closely related to each other than they are to their children. The gene's eye view says that altruistic behavior in bees evolved because it was the most effective method for the bees' genes to reproduce themselves. The genes were behaving selfishly by incentivizing the bees to behave altruistically. In contrast, from a group selection perspective, altruism evolved in bees because the bees were living in groups, hives, and the groups were the ones competing with one another. Groups of bees with more altruistic individuals did better than groups with more selfish individuals, and so the altruistic behavior spread. From this perspective, it's the groups that are behaving selfishly by incentivizing the bees to behave altruistically. The groups have self here. Both of these theories, the gene's eye view and group selection, were developed in response to a puzzle. The puzzle is that all the time we see creatures engaging in helping behavior, which negatively affects their fitness. Evolutionary theory says that this kind of thing shouldn't happen, so if it does, we need an explanation why. And the explanation that both of these theories provide asks us to change our idea of where agency, and thus selfishness, is located in the system. The gene's eye view says agency doesn't belong to the bees are being controlled by their genes, and their genes are behaving selfishly. And likewise, the group selection view says agency doesn't belong to the bees are being controlled by the hive, and the hive is behaving selfishly. So this is why I ended my last video that way, saying that selfishness at one level is altruism at another, and that altruism is action in the service of a higher self. That's because when we see altruism, it's a signal that should alert us to the fact that our intuitions about self and agency are going to be challenged. When we see altruism, it's evidence that there's a different sort of self, somewhere else, that's motivating the behavior. We have all these intuitions about agency and free will and identity that are based in our experience as humans, with skin and 4 limbs and language. But when you start to look closer at the biological world, you realize that those intuitions don't quite hold up. Do worker bees perceive themselves as autonomous bees, or as genetic slaves, or as part of a larger beehive self? Who knows? Maybe it's all 3. I think the moral here is that when you're trying to understand how cooperation works, what you'll find, paradoxically, is that cooperation is most effective when the participating creatures are allowed to behave selfishly. This doesn't mean anything goes. That wouldn't work at all. What it means is that the most effective groups have managed to bias their members' options so that a selfish choice for the member is also a good choice for the group. In other words, the best groups transform selfishness into altruism.